Print culture and the modern world. Introduction. It is difficult for us to imagine a world without printed matter. We find evidence of print everywhere around us. In books, journals, newspapers, prints of famous paintings, and also in everyday things like theatre programs, official circulars, calendars, diaries, advertisements, cinema posters at street corners. We read printed literature, see printed image, follow the news to newspapers, and track public debates that appear in print. We take for granted this world of print and often forget that there was a time before print. We may not realize that print itself has a history which has in fact shaped our contemporary world. What is this history? When did printed literature begin to circulate? How has it helped create the modern world?
The first printed books. The earliest kind of print technology was developed in China, Japan, and Korea. This was a system of hand printing. From AD 594 onwards, books in China were printed by rubbing paper, also invented there, against the inked surface of wood blocks. As both sides of the thin, porous sheet could not be printed, the traditional Chinese accordion book was folded and stitched at the side. Superbly skilled craftsmen could duplicate with remarkable accuracy the beauty of calligraphy. The imperial state in China was, for a very long time, the major producer of printed material. China possessed a huge bureaucratic system which recruited its personnel through civil service examinations. Textbooks for this examination were printed in vast numbers under the sponsorship of the imperial state. From the 16th century, the number of examination candidates went up, and that increased the volume of print. By the 17th century, as urban culture bloomed in China, the uses of print diversified. Print was no longer used just by scholar officials. Merchants used print in their everyday life as they collected trade information. Reading increasingly became a leisure activity. The new readership preferred fictional narratives, poetry, autobiographies, anthologies of literary masterpieces, and romantic plays. Rich women began to read, and many women began publishing their poetry and plays. Wives of scholar officials published their works, and courtesans wrote about their lives. This new reading culture was accompanied by a new technology. Western printing techniques and mechanical presses were imported in the late 19th century as Western powers established their outposts in China. Shanghai became the hub of the new print culture, catering to the Western-style schools. From hand printing, there was now a gradual shift to mechanical printing. Print in Japan. Buddhist missionaries from China introduced hand printing technology into Japan around AD 768 to 770. The oldest Japanese book printed in AD 868 is the Buddhist Diamond Sutra, containing 6 sheets of text and woodcut illustrations. Pictures were printed on textiles, playing cards, and paper money. In medieval Japan, poets and prose writers were regularly published, and books were cheap and abundant. Printing of visual material led to interesting publishing practices. In the late 18th century, in the flourishing urban circles at Edo, illustrated collections of paintings depicted an elegant urban culture involving artists, courtesans, and tea-house gatherings. Libraries and bookstores were packed with hand-printed material of various types. Books on women, musical instruments, calculations, tea ceremony, flower arrangements, proper etiquette, cooking, and famous places. Time for few interesting facts. The world's oldest surviving book is Chinese. It's a Buddhist text called the Diamond Sutra, which bears the date 868 AD. Along with other printed manuscripts, the book was discovered in 1907 in a walled-up cave in Da Nang, northwest China, and is on display at the British Library. Even before the development of paper, the Chinese were using woodblock printing to print on silk, which is amazing. The earliest surviving woodblock printed are silk fragments that date back to the Han Dynasty. Before this, as in 3000 years ago, Chinese were recording events in a written language on what are known as oracle bones. These bones and turtle shells with about 4000 character markings were found in the early 1900s by archaeologists.
Print comes to Europe. For centuries, silk and spices from China flowed into Europe through the Silk Route. In the 11th century, Chinese paper reached Europe via the same route. Manuscripts were carefully written by scribes. In 1295, Marco Polo, a great explorer, returned to Italy after many years of exploration in China. Now, Italians began producing books with woodblocks, and soon the technology of woodblock printing spread to other parts of Europe. Luxury editions were still handwritten on very expensive vellum, meant for aristocratic circles and rich monastic libraries, which scoffed at printed books as cheap vulgarities. As the demand for books increased, booksellers all over Europe began exporting books to many different countries. Book fairs were still held at different places. Scribes or skilled handwriters were no longer solely employed by wealthy or influential patrons, but increasingly by booksellers as well. More than 50 scribes often worked for one bookseller. With the growing demand for books, woodblock printing gradually became more and more popular. By the early 15th century, woodblocks were being widely used in Europe to print textiles, playing cards, and religious pictures with simple, brief text. There was clearly a great need for even quicker and cheaper production of text. This could only be with the invention of a new print technology. The breakthrough occurred at Strasbourg, Germany, where Johann Gutenberg developed the first known printing press in the 1430s. Johann Gutenberg and the printing press. Gutenberg was the son of a merchant and grew up on a large agricultural estate. From his childhood he had seen wine and olive presses. The olive press provided the model for the printing press, and molds were used to cast the metal types for the letters of the alphabets. By 1448, Gutenberg perfected the system. The first book he printed was the Bible. The new technology did not entirely displace the existing art of producing books by hand. In fact, printed books at first closely resembled the written manuscripts in appearance and layout. The metal letters imitated the ornamental handwritten styles. Borders were illuminated by hand with foliage and other patterns, and illustrations were painted also by hand. As the number of printing presses grew, book production boomed. The second half of the 15th century saw 20 million copies of printed books flooding the markets in Europe. The number went up in the 16th century to about 200 million copies. This shift from hand printing to mechanical printing led to the print revolution. Did you know that Johann Gutenberg was born in 1398 in Mainz, Germany, and he died on February 3rd, 1468 in the same place? On February 3rd, 1468, Johannes Gutenberg was buried in the Franciscan church in Mainz, where many members of his family were also laid to rest. During his last years, Gutenberg became blind and was plagued by frail health. In 1468, Gutenberg died and was buried in the Franciscan church in Mainz. The church and its cemetery were destroyed later on, and Gutenberg's grave was lost. Despite being unsuccessful financially in his life, Johannes Gutenberg played an important part in making printing a reality, which can be credited with speeding up the Renaissance. Gutenberg's statue was later built by Bertel Thorvaldsen in Mainz, Germany.
The print revolution and its impact. The print revolution was not just a development, it was a new way of producing books, and it transformed the lives of people, changing their relationship to information and knowledge and with institutions and authorities. It influenced popular perceptions and opened up new ways of looking at things. A new reading public. With the printing press, a new reading public emerged. Printing reduced the cost of books. Also, the time and labor required to produce each book came down and multiple copies were produced with great ease. Books flooded the market, reaching out to an ever-growing readership. Access to books created a new culture of reading. Earlier, reading was restricted to the elites. Common people lived in a world of oral culture. They heard sacred texts which were read out, ballads recited, and folk tales narrated. Knowledge was transferred orally. Before the age of print, books were really expensive and were not produced in sufficient number. Now books could reach out to wider sections of people. The books could only be read by the literate, and literacy rates in most of the European countries were very low till the 20th century. Printers began publishing popular ballads and folk tales, and such types of books were illustrated with pictures. These were sung and recited in villages and in taverns in towns for those who enjoyed listening to books being read out and did not read. Oral culture thus entered print, and printed material was orally transmitted. Religious debates and the fear of print. Print had created the possibility of wide circulation of ideas. Through the printed message, they could persuade people to think differently and move them to action. This had significance in different spheres of life. Not everyone welcomed the printed book, and those who welcomed printed books did have fears about it. Many were afraid of the effects it would have on people's minds. It was feared that if there was no control over what was printed and read, then rebellious and irreligious thoughts would spread. This anxiety was the basis of widespread criticism of the new printed literature that had started to circulate. In 1517, the religious reformer Martin Luther wrote 95 of these criticizing the practices and rituals of the Roman Catholic Church. A printed copy of this was posted on a church door in Wittenberg. Luther's writings were reproduced in vast numbers and read widely. This led to a division within the church and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Deeply grateful to print, Luther said, "Printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one." Several scholars believe that print helped spread the new ideas that led to Reformation. Print and dissent. Print and popular religious literature stimulated many individual interpretations of faith even among little educated working people. In the 16th century, Manocchio, a miller in Italy, began to read books that were available in his locality. When the Roman Church began its inquisition to repress heretical ideas, Manocchio was hauled up twice and ultimately executed. The Roman Church began to maintain an index of prohibited books from 1558.
The 19th century. The 19th century saw vast leaps in mass literacy in Europe, bringing in large numbers of new readers among children, women, and workers. As primary education became compulsory from the late 19th century, children became an important category of readers. Production of school textbooks became critical for the publishing industry. A children's press devoted to literature for children alone was set up in France in 1857. This press published new works as well as old fairy tales and folk tales. The Grimm brothers in Germany spent years compiling traditional folk tales gathered from peasants. What they collected was edited before the stories were published in a collection in 1812. Anything that was considered unsuitable for children or would appear vulgar to the elites, a select group that is superior in terms of ability or qualities to the rest of a group or society, was not included in the published version. Rural folktales thus acquired a new form. In this way, print recorded old tales but also changed them. Women became important as readers as well as writers. Penny magazines were especially meant for women, as were manuals teaching proper behavior and housekeeping. When novels began to be written in the 19th century, women were seen as important readers. Some of the best-known novelists were women: Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot. Their writings became important in defining a new type of women. A person with will, strength of personality, determination, and the power to think. Lending libraries had been in existence from the 17th century onwards. In the 19th century, lending libraries in England became instruments for educating white-collar workers. White-collar worker is a person who performs professional, managerial, or administrative work. Artisans and lower middle-class people. Sometimes self-educated working-class people wrote for themselves. After the working day was gradually shortened from the mid-19th century, workers had some time for self-improvement and self-expression. They wrote political tracts and autobiographies in large numbers. Further innovations. By the late 18th century, the press came to be made out of metal. Through the 19th century, there were a series of further innovations in printing technology. In the mid-19th century, Richard M. Howe of New York had perfected power-driven cylindrical press. This was capable of printing 8,000 sheets per hour. This press was particularly useful for printing newspapers. In the late 19th century, the offset press was developed, which could print up to 6 colors at a time. From the turn of the 20th century, electrically operated presses accelerated printing operations. A series of other developments followed. Methods of fading paper improved. The quality of plates became better. Automatic paper reels and photoelectric controls of the color register were introduced. The accumulation of several individual mechanical improvements transformed the appearance of printed text. Printers and publishers continuously developed new strategies to sell their product. 19th century periodicals serialized important novels, which gave birth to a particular way of writing novels. In the 1920s in England, popular works were sold in cheap series, called the shilling series. The dust cover or the book jacket is also a 20th century innovation. With the onset of Great Depression in the 1930s, publishers feared a decline in book purchases. To sustain buying, they bought out cheap paperback editions.
So basically, Hickey had published a lot of gossip about the company's senior officials. So obviously this would anger the Governor General Warren Hastings, and so he persecuted Hickey and encouraged the publication of officially sanctioned newspapers in which he can cover up Hickey's information and he can counter the flow of information by Hickey that had damaged the image of the colonial government. So by the close of the 18th century, a number of newspapers and journals appeared in print. There were Indians too, who began to publish Indian newspapers. The first to appear was a weekly Bengal Gazette brought out by Gangadhar Bhattacharya, who was close to Ram Mohan Roy. India and the world of print. Manuscripts before the age of print. India had a very rich and old tradition of handwritten manuscripts in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, as well as in various vernacular languages. Well, manuscripts were not used that frequently because they were highly fragile and expensive. They were really difficult to read because they were written in different styles. Even though pre-colonial Bengal had developed an extensive network of village primary schools, students very often did not read texts. They only learned to write, and teachers dictated portions of texts from memory and students wrote them down. Many thus became literate without ever actually reading any kinds of text. Print comes to India. The printing press first came to Goa with Portuguese missionaries in the mid-16th century. Jesuit priests learned Konkani and printed several tracts. So basically, Jesuit priests were the priests who were the members of the Society of Jesus. By 1674, about 50 books had been printed in the Konkani and in Kannada languages. Catholic priests printed the first Tamil book in 1579,
at Cochin, and in 1713 the first Malayalam book was printed by them. By 1710, Dutch Protestant missionaries had printed 32 Tamil texts, many of them translations of older works. The points which were discussed right now are very important from exam point of view. The English language press did not grow in India till quite late, even though the English East India Company began to import presses from the late 17th century. From 1780, James Augustus Hickey began to edit the Bengal Gazette, a weekly magazine that described itself as a commercial paper open to all, but influenced by none. So it was private English enterprise, proud of its independence from colonial influence, that began English printing in India. Hickey published a lot of advertisements, including those that related to the import and sale of slaves. By sale of slaves, you might remember abolition of slavery, which was there in the chapter of French Revolution in grade 9. But he also published a lot of gossip about the company's senior officials in India. Enraged by this, Governor General Warren Hastings persecuted Hickey and encouraged the publication of officially sanctioned newspapers that could counter the flow of information that damaged the image of the colonial government.
From the early 19th century, there were intense debates around religious issues. Different groups confronted the changes happening within colonial society in different ways, offering a variety of new interpretations of the beliefs of different religions. Some criticized existing practices and campaigned for reform, while others countered the arguments of reformers. These debates were carried out in public and in print. Printed tracts and newspapers not only spread the new ideas, but they shaped the nature of the debate. A wider public could now participate in these public discussions and express their views, and also new ideas emerged through these clashes of opinions. This was a time of intense controversies between social and religious reformers and the Hindu orthodoxy over matters like widow immolation, monotheism, Brahmanical priesthood, and idolatry. In Bengal, as the debate developed, tracts and newspapers proliferated, circulating a variety of arguments. To reach a wider audience, the ideas were printed in the everyday, spoken language of ordinary people. Ram Mohan Roy published the Sambad Kaumudi from 1821, and the Hindu orthodoxy commissioned the Samachar Chandrika to oppose his opinions. From 1822, two Persian newspapers were published, Jam-i-Jahan Nama and Shamsul Akbar. In the same year, a Gujarati newspaper, the Bombay Samachar, made its appearance. In North India, the ulama were deeply anxious about the collapse of Muslim dynasties. They feared that colonial rulers would encourage conversion, change the Muslim personal laws. To counter this, they used cheap lithographic presses, published Persian and Urdu translations of holy scriptures, and printed religious newspapers and tracts. The Deoband Seminary, founded in 1867, published thousands upon thousands of fatwas telling Muslim readers how to conduct themselves in everyday lives and explaining the meaning of Islamic doctrines. All through the 19th century, a number of Muslim sects and seminars appeared, each with a different interpretation of faith, each keen on enlarging its following and countering the influence of its opponents. Urdu print helped them conduct these battles in public. Among Hindus too, print encouraged the reading of religious texts, especially in the vernacular languages. The first printed edition of the Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas, a 16th century text, came out from Calcutta in 1810. By the mid-19th century, cheap lithographic editions flooded North Indian markets. From the 1880s, the Naval Kishore Press at Lucknow and the Sri Venkateshwar Press in Bombay published numerous religious texts in vernaculars. In their printed and portable form, These could be easily read by the faithful at any place and time. They could also be read out to large groups of illiterate men and women. Religious texts, therefore, reached a very wide circle of people, encouraging discussions, debates, and controversies within and among different religions. Print did not only stimulate the publication of conflicting opinions among communities, but it also connected communities and people in different parts of India. Newspapers conveyed news from one place to another, creating pan-Indian identities. As more people could now read, they wanted to see their own lives, emotions, and relationships reflected in writings. The novel, a literary form developed in Europe, ideally catered to this need. It soon developed in Indian forms and styles too. Other literary forms that entered the world of reading included short stories, lyrics, and essays about social and political matters. In different ways, they put emphasis on human lives and feelings of the people about the political and social rules that shaped such things. By the end of the 19th century, a new expression was developing amongst the people. With the setting up of a number of printing presses, visual images could be easily reproduced in multiple copies. Painters like Raja Ravi Verma produced images for mass circulation. Cheap prints and calendars were also available in the bazaar and could be bought by the poor people as well. These prints began shaping popular ideas of modernity and tradition, religion and politics and society and culture. In the 1870s, caricatures and cartoons were being published in journals and newspapers, commenting on social and political matters. Some caricatures mocked the educated Indians' fascination with Western culture and taste, whereas the others expressed fear regarding social change. There were also caricatures criticizing imperial rule and others that publicly criticized nationalists. As you can see in figure 18 on page 124, the cover page of Indian Charivari. The Indian Charivari was one of the many journals of caricature and satire published in the late 19th century. You can notice that the imperial British figure is positioned right at the center. He is authoritative and commanding, telling the natives what is to be done. The natives sit on either side of him, willing to serve and submissive. Lives of women begin to be written in strong, clear and intense ways. Women reading therefore increased enormously in middle-class homes. Liberal husbands and fathers began educating the women folk in their houses after mid-19th century. Many journals promoted education of women and explained why it is necessary to educate women. They also carried a syllabus useful for homeschooling. But not all families were liberal. Conservative Hindus and Muslims felt that women shouldn't be educated. Sometimes the rebel women defied such prohibitions. Women like Rashundari Devi, who belonged to a very orthodox family, learned to read in the secrecy of her kitchen and then later went on to write her autobiography in 1876 titled Amar Jivan. People soon developed interest in what women would have to say about their own lives. Women like Kailas Bhashani Devi, Tarabai Shinde and Pandita Ramabai Saraswati wrote books focusing on the experiences of women with passionate anger. While Urdu, Tamil and Bengali print culture had developed early, Hindi started seriously only from the 1870s. Soon, a large segment was devoted to women. In the early 20th century, journals written for and sometimes edited by women became extremely popular. They discussed issues like women's education, widowhood, widow remarriage, and national movement. Some of them offered household and fashion lessons to women and brought entertainment through short stories and serialized books. While Urdu, Tamil and Bengali print culture had developed early, Hindi started seriously only from the 1870s. Soon, a large segment was devoted to women. In the early 20th century, journals written for and sometimes edited by women became extremely popular. They discussed issues like women's education, widowhood, widow remarriage, and national movement. Some of them offered household and fashion lessons to women and brought entertainment through short stories and serialized books. In Punjab, a similar folk literature was widely printed from the early 20th century. Ram Chadda published Istri Dharam Vichar to teach women how to be obedient wives. The Khalsa Tract Society published cheap books delivering a similar message. In Bengal, an area of central Calcutta, the Batla, was devoted to the printing of popular books. Cheap editions of religious tracts and scriptures, as well as literature that was considered obscene and scandalous, were also sold here. By the late 19th century, a lot of these books were being illustrated in woodcuts and color lithographs. Peddlers took the Batla publications to home, enabling women to read them leisurely. Very cheap small books were brought to the markets in the 19th century. They were sold in Madras towns and at crossroads, allowing poor people travelling to markets to buy them. Public libraries were set up from the early 20th century, expanding the access to books. These libraries were located mostly in cities and towns and at times in prosperous villages. From the late 19th century, issues of caste discrimination began to be written about in many printed tracts and essays. Jyotiba Phule, the Maratha pioneer of low-caste protest movements, wrote about the injustice of the caste system in his Gulmagri in 1871. In the 20th century, B.R. Ambedkar in Maharashtra and E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar in Madras, better known as Periyar, wrote powerfully on caste, and their writings were read by people all over India. Workers in factories were too overworked and lacked the education to write much about their experiences. But Kashi Baba, a Kanpur mill worker, wrote and published Chote aur Bade Ka Sawal in 1938 to show the links between caste and class exploitation. The poems of another Kanpur mill worker who wrote on the name Sudarshan Chakra between 1935 and 1955 were brought together and published in a collection called Sachi Kavityan. By the 1930s, Bangalore cotton mill workers set up libraries to educate themselves, following the example of Bombay workers.
Print had a huge impact on its readers. This impact was underestimated by the East India Company till 1798. However, when the company started facing resistance owing to Indian nationalist publications, they started imposing restrictions on them. Initially, some Englishmen criticized the company's misrule and the ill behavior of some of the company's officers. This worried the company and they started putting controls on what was printed against them. By the 1820s, the Supreme Court passed certain regulations to control press freedom. The company only encouraged newspapers that wrote in its favor. However, in 1835, editors of Englishman and vernacular newspaper filed a petition that compelled Governor-General Bentinck to revise the press laws. Later, Thomas Macaulay, a liberal colonial official, formulated rules that got back the editors their freedom. Soon after the revolt of 1857, the annoyed Englishmen demanded a clampdown on the local press. As Indian newspapers wanted to spread the feeling of nationalism and patriotism, the Englishmen started contemplating the imposition of strict censorship on such nationalist publications. Consequently, the Vernacular Press Act was passed in 1878. This gave the government the right to censor the reports and editorials in the vernacular press. If any rebellious writing was found, the press was warned, and if the press ignored the warning, then it had to face the consequences. The printing press of the offending publication was seized by the government.